Okay, we are back. So welcome back, everybody. We are now on to our next panel, looking at sort of carbon markets and carbon contracts. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers and then get out of the way and let them talk because I'm sure they have a lot of information to say. So I will find my first bio and start with Dr. Farrell. Dr. Farrell is currently a professor in the Oklahoma State Department of Agricultural Economics, where he specializes in agricultural law. He grew up on a cattle and wheat operation in western Oklahoma and obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State before obtaining his Juris Doctorate from Oklahoma City University School of Law with endorsements in estate planning and business and financial services law. Shannon spent a number of years in private practice focusing on agricultural, environmental, energy, and corporate law before joining Oklahoma State in the summer of 2017. And then I will introduce our next speaker is Josh Maxwell. Josh serves as a policy director for the Republican leader of the House Agricultural Committee, Congressman Glenn G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania. Previously, Josh served at the committee as a senior professional staff for K. Michael Conway from Texas and was lead policy advisor for the Conservation, Forestry Credit, and Energy titles during the 2018 Farm Bill. Josh has served in similar roles at the committee for Congressman Frank Lucas from Oklahoma during the 2014 Farm Bill and Congressman Bob Goodlatte from Virginia for the 2018 Farm Bill. Prior to this, Josh served as the legislative correspondent for Congressman Joe Barton, a Republican from Texas. So I will turn it over to Dr. Farrell first and let him get kind of kicked off with an overview and some of the legal issues.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Job number one, can you guys hear me okay? I'll look at the chat to make sure you guys can actually hear me all right. I know there's lots of joy over the past couple of years in doing everything via Zoom. I get that. I also apologize for not having my camera on. I'll spare you guys the gory details. I had a little bit of an eye injury about 3 weeks ago, and I wear a pirate patch now, and I'm in adjustment, so nobody really needs to see that. You just need to see the brilliance of the PowerPoint here, which I'll keep an eye on my personal text messages here. Paul, let me know if our PowerPoint is up and running. But my goal for this part of the session is hopefully to tee Josh up really well, because Josh is very well connected to a lot of the regulatory and technical issues that really are going to guide a lot of these contracts. But at least for right now, I'm going to give you questions. And I went through last night and counted them. There's 36 of them, and the number keeps growing, that you need to be asking yourself if you or someone that you assist in your professional capacity is being presented with a carbon sequestration or a greenhouse gas destruction contract. So let's talk about that for just a second. What we're really trying to do is get greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And we've got a couple of ways of doing that. You know, in the oil and gas industry specifically, lots of folks are looking at taking carbon dioxide and to a lesser extent methane and literally just cramming it back down under the ground. But we don't really have that option so much in agriculture. In agriculture, we primarily have two ways of handling this. We can try to take atmospheric carbon dioxide and get it into a form of carbon that we can store in the soil and keep it there for quite some time. Or alternatively, if you're in livestock production especially, you have the opportunity to take methane and some other greenhouse gases that are produced by the operation and destroy those in the process of perhaps electrical generation. So you might have a methane digester capturing methane, burning it as fuel, and you're thinking to yourself, well, we're burning gases. Is that making things any better? Well, yes, actually it is, because you're destroying methane, which is a much more potent gas for greenhouse effects than carbon dioxide is, and it's destroying that before it actually releases to the atmosphere. Mostly today, I'm going to be talking about the agricultural practices that are used to sequester organic carbon in the soil, but you can take a lot of the questions that we're going to ask ourselves today and say, well, these also apply if we're talking about maybe a methane digester or one of those technologies as well. But as you'd expect, different technologies and different conversion practices have different rates of carbon sequestration, which we've got represented here as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. And then accordingly, they all have different break-even prices. In other words, what does the market price of carbon have to be for an agricultural producer to get enough in terms of a carbon sequestration credit to justify making that kind of production change. And really, at the end of the day, if you're a producer trying to evaluate, should I be entering into these carbon markets, you're really just trying to ask yourself, can I clear a profit in making the production practice change I need to make to sequester enough carbon to generate the carbon returns to offset what I'm losing in terms of foregone revenue, increased expenses from changing production systems, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the production practices change that you make is going to have a larger or smaller effect on carbon sequestration. As you can see from this chart, and this is some data collected from the University of Illinois, probably the greatest impact change would be to turn from a completely cultivated field into permanent grassland. In other words, you're almost taking a cultivated field and moving it to a CRP based contract in a way, which of course, you would expect to have the greatest concentration of carbon storage, but you're also experiencing the greatest loss in terms of, economic productivity from that land too by making that change. Similarly, the break-even price for carbon capture via methane, I'm sorry, I say carbon, I apologize. I say methane destruction with a lagoon. If we're talking about a 2,500 head dairy, the break-even price is really low because you've managed to amortize that price over a lot of head on your operation. That's not an opportunity that's available to everybody, though, if you don't already have that concentrated animal feeding operation right there. So all this to say, one of the first things I want you to do if you're a producer is to just evaluate what is the carbon storage potential for my farm if I make some of these production changes. And then later on in this presentation, we'll talk about how do we go about systematically analyzing, are those changes going to be economically viable for me? What does the marketplace look like? I think in 2 words, the words are still evolving. It's not the Wild West. I don't want to say that, and Josh can actually speak a lot more intelligently to this point, but we are very much in a phase of discovery. We have a small number of mandatory markets that are out there. For example, California's Air Resources Board does have some cap and trade system in place out there in California, and some of the registries and exchanges are participating in that marketplace. But by and large, it's free market transactions. You have folks that want to be seen as environmentally active, people that are trying to be able to tell their customers and their investors that they are actively working to offset their carbon emissions to achieve a net zero goal in many cases by some certain date. And so what you see is there are a number of private enterprises that are trying to validate the carbon sequestration activities of a number of actors, package those, create those credits in a serialized fashion so we can prove that there's not double counting, and then allowing those credits to be purchased to say, hey, if I've generated 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent gases, well, then I have purchased that same offset in the amount of 1 ton, so I have net zero affected global greenhouse gas emissions. Like I said, a lot of this has been a response to investor demands. We're seeing increasingly a lot of push from corporate investors that they see net zero emissions targets from their companies. And then some companies just want to have green cred. They just want to be able to tell consumers, hey, we're actually taking this climate change stuff seriously. So here's what we're doing about it. Having said all that, and since this market is still very much evolving, one of the things that we're really struggling for, especially if you're an economist, you care about this, is better price information. And we're getting that in some markets, but it's still kind of opaque in terms of what practices are actually being performed consistently, what's the value of that, and we're really, in the context of all that, struggling with price discovery to really figure out, like, okay, what is the true social cost of carbon, and then how is that cost being allocated back to the people that are actually doing the sequestration. Now, interestingly, earlier this year, the CME Group said that they were going to start doing futures trading in carbon offsets, and lots of people hailed that decision because they viewed that as a very important step forward in getting better price discovery information for everybody. The Intercontinental Exchange is already doing that, but they're doing that in a very specific marketplace, and that is that California cap and trade marketplace that we mentioned just a little bit earlier. All right, you're a producer. You've said, I'm kind of interested in this carbon sequestration thing. What can I do here? How do I start getting involved with this market? How do I interact with it? And so, very rarely, and Josh may have better information than I do on this point, at least from the conversations that I've had, I've talked to very few producers that are actually directly interfacing with a registry or with a marketplace. They're usually using some form of an intermediary. And the intermediaries that are currently active in the market tend to fall into 2 categories. One is an aggregator, and that aggregator is simply, you know, I do a lot of work in renewable energy development with wind and solar, and I would refer to the aggregator here as a project developer. In other words, they're going out trying to sign up acres. And in this case, we're trying to find people who are willing to commit acres to carbon sequestration efforts, packaging those together, and then selling that package to someone who needs a large amount of acreage. So they might try to go out and get 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 acres of people that are willing to commit to carbon sequestration projects and then sell that project. Then they take part of the profit, obviously retaining a share of the profit for themselves, and then pay those acres directly out of their pocket, basically acting as that intermediary. Or you might also be running into a data manager. Now, a data manager is a little bit more of what I would call perhaps a direct facilitator, in that they're trying to work alongside the farmer and not really directly take over the project, aggregate, and bundle it, but they're really almost more of a consultant to the producer to say, hey, I want to help you interface with this market. And if I get you there, you just agree that you'll give me a certain percentage of the revenue that you get from the sales of your credits. Well, I've talked about registries a few times. What's a registry? In the absence of a national marketplace and a really national standard for how we go about authenticating, you have sequestered X metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into your soil. And we all recognize that you need to have these standards in place in order for you to receive X amount of money for your carbon credits, and so on and so on and so on. We have a lot of private entities out there that are trying to perform that service. And, with any industry, you probably see this number continue to increase for a while until someone starts to gain a little bit more market power, kind of prove that they're the big dog in town. And then eventually you probably settle down to a much smaller number of these registries, maybe perhaps, 2, 3, or maybe even one emerges as the dominant standard there. But in the meantime, as I've kind of looked at the landscape, there are about, I think, 6 registries that I consistently see when we're talking about collecting this information together. One's the American Carbon the American Carbon Registry, which is a subsidiary of Winrock. And then we have the Gold Standard Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, Plan Vivo, which is a subunit of the Market, and no, that's not a typo, that's actually how they spell it, registry. The Verified Carbon Standard, which is also called Verra, and then the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standards, or CCBS Registry. Registries serve, in a way, an auditory function. They set standards for what has to be done for them to say you have sequestered X amount of carbon dioxide equivalent. And like I mentioned earlier, if an acre of land, and let's pick, we'll pick a legal description, right? This 1 acre of land in northeast Logan County, Oklahoma, where I'm sitting right now, has committed to these carbon sequestration practices, which the registry says will sequester 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That acre of land sequestering that metric ton of carbon is assigned a serial number. And so the point of assigning that serial number is to make sure that when we talk about these carbon credits being exchanged, sold, bought, purchased, et cetera, we're not double counting them. That 1 metric ton of carbon is sequestered. We don't get to do that again. Even if we take it from one party and sell it to another, that doesn't mean we sequestered another ton of carbon. So again, this auditing function that the registries provide is very important to make sure that we're actually doing what we're saying we're doing, and that is sequestering this 1 metric ton of carbon. Like I said, we might see more registries evolve. We might see these consolidate over time. And I suspect, like with most industries, we'll see them kind of condense down a little bit as we start to see more standardization across the industry. Well, if you're a producer, obviously one of the first things that you're asking, other than how am I going to get paid, is if I've got to sequester this carbon, how does this impact my land use? And I say that this is going to be an almost universal thing. Like, you're going to have to change something about your production practices in order to sequester carbon. Is it possible that you could get credit for carbon that you already sequestered? Let's say that you converted to a no-till system 10 years ago. Odds are you're probably racking up some soil carbon as a result of that. Some registries will allow retroactive credit for past changes to production practices, but those opportunities are somewhat limited. So what you're probably asking yourself prospectively is, going forward, is it worth my while to change production practices so I can sequester this carbon, but also realize the revenues to be had from the sale of the carbon offsets? So that's the first question: is what do I have to do to sequester carbon? Am I moving from conventional tillage to a no-till system? Am I moving from conventional to a low-till? Am I moving from, let's say, a cultivation to flat out grassland conversion? Am I going to try to reforest a wetland or reestablish a wetland? So there's lots of things that you can do, and it kind of depends on what your production plans are, and you think that that can really integrate into your whole farm enterprise plan. Of course, we'll talk about partial budget analysis here in just a few slides, but you have to start thinking to yourself, okay, if I convert, let's say, from conventional to no-till, what am I giving up in terms of productivity? What am I giving up in terms of yield? How does this affect my acreage and, again, my whole farm plan? Am I going to need a new complement of equipment? And if I am moving from conventional to no-till, the answer is yes, I'm going to have a pretty significant change to my equipment complement. But in the long term, that might also be saving me money. So again, you have to think about this question very holistically. But importantly, you also have to ask yourself, if I sign up for this project, who else might have rights of access, or in some cases, even a property interest to my property as a result of me entering into this carbon sequestration agreement? We're going to talk about the Australian system here in just a couple of slides, which is pretty interesting. But you have to understand, until that point, we're potentially saying, I'm giving other parties some form of a property interest. What does that come with? Does that mean that they can tell me what to do on my farm? Does that mean they actually have a physical right of entry to my farm? Do they have a right to constrain what I can do on my farm? So those are all things you have to look at in the context of your agreement. Now, if the whole point of this enterprise is that we're actually trying to stick carbon and other greenhouse gases into the ground, how do we verify that? Is that verified empirically? In other words, many people would say that the gold standard is, if we want to authenticate how much carbon we're sticking in your soil, we need to come out to your farm and measure how much carbon's in your soil. Not a whole lot of registries that I've looked at so far are doing that directly. Lots of times they're doing this basically on a calculation basis. And an analogy for that is in the air emissions sector. When we're talking about the Clean Air Act, some companies authenticate their air emissions based on calculations only. We processed X amount of these chemicals, and using stoichiometric equations, we can show you that we emitted Y tons of this gas. But for others, it's an active sensor logging system. In other words, we have sensor exhaust stream, and we will authenticate, pound for pound, we're emitting this much tonnage of this gas. So that's obviously one of the most important things for you to ask yourself in the context of your agreement is, how do we authenticate how much carbon I'm getting paid to sequester? Is that something that's going to be measured? And if so, again, what are the rights of access? How often is measurement going to take place? What happens if I don't meet that standard? What if I say that I'm sequestering 1 ton per year of carbon, but I'm actually only sequestering 3/4 of a ton? Or what if I have some practice that's susceptible to a release? And this may not be as big of a deal in agriculture, where we're talking about fairly stable storage systems. But if I was someone who was putting carbon dioxide down an empty natural gas well, and there was a pressure failure on my natural gas well, and I released a lot of that carbon dioxide, well, I can release a lot of my sequestered carbon pretty fast. What are the consequences of that? If there's some sort of an adverse finding, let's say that the measurements were wrong, I was actually sequestering more carbon than you thought I was, or you assessed a penalty against me for not following practices when it turns out that I was, what's my appeals process there? How do I go about fixing that decision? Now, we'll get a little bit deeper into the little nerd realm. Let's talk about how we might affect land transfers. One of the first questions I think lots of producers might have is, if I lease my land, is it even possible for me to get credit for carbon sequestration? And the answer I would give to everybody is that anytime that you're contemplating any sort of change like that on leased land, you better involve the landowner in the conversation. And that's a whole separate discussion with respect to the negotiating power between the landlord and the tenant. And I think, the inevitable question is, well, how do we allocate any revenues that we get from this between landlord and tenant? And my inevitable response to that is, who's bearing the respective costs of that? Are we talking about a cash basis lease? Are we talking about a share basis lease? Who's bearing the cost of equipment? Who's had the, reduction in revenues? Who's had the increase in costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's lots of things to sort out there. I don't believe it's an impossibility, but it's something that definitely needs to involve both landlord and tenant. Once we've signed up land for carbon sequestration, can it be leased or sold to another party? And I think what you're going to run into is that it's an important question to ask in terms of the length of the commitment. If we're talking about the fact that we have to keep carbon sequestered for 50 years in order to receive the credit, well, then you're almost inevitably going to have some sort of restriction on the transfer of the land in either the form of a negative easement, perhaps a conservation easement, or some other tool that says you have to maintain this practice even if you've purchased this land. And obviously, that's going to affect purchase prices. And in Australia, they take it one step further. In order for you to receive carbon offset credits in Australia, you have to have a carbon sequestration right, which is a function of state law in Australia, and creates what I would characterize as an easement in the property that enables the person who purchased that carbon credit to enforce your sequestration efforts. In other words, they have an interest in property, specifically your property, to make sure that the sequestration practice that created the credit always stays in place. I think an equivalent to that in America could be that some states might recognize a conservation easement, much to similar effect, to basically say there is a restriction on the development of this property that restricts you from doing anything that would negate the carbon sequestration efforts that have already taken place. To that end, how long is a carbon sequestration agreement going to last? And again, remember the point of this whole discussion that we talked about in the first slide was that we want to permanently sequester carbon in some way so as to take it out of the atmosphere. But I have seen some contracts that are for 10 years. I've seen some contracts that are for 50 years. I've seen some contracts that are for 100 years. So it just really varies. But you have to ask yourself as a landowner, again, what am I going to have to do to sequester this carbon? And what am I going to have to do to guarantee that that stays in place for the length of that agreement? I haven't seen a lot of carbon contracts that have extensions. It's possible. The contracts I have examined generally say they're in place for some specific primary period, and that's it. But it is possible that there are extensions out there. If that's the case, then you need to make sure that you understand what can be renegotiated at those renewal periods. All right, you've done what you needed to do. You've converted to the low-till system. You've reforested your wetland. You're capturing methane from your dairy. What's ongoing? Well, we kind of already alluded to this, but if you need to sell the land or if you need some sort of an estate transfer, what kind of restrictions are you going to face? Do you need to make sure that there are restrictions written into whatever those transfer documents are to make sure the sequestration efforts remain in place? If you don't, does another party have the right to intervene? Can the purchaser of the carbon credit say, hey, we had a deal. You said you're going to sequester this carbon. You're not doing it. I now have the right to seek an injunction to basically make you sequester the carbon. Is that possible? It kind of depends on the language of the agreement. And it also depends on how courts would look at the language of the agreement to say, does this actually rise to the level that would give you an opportunity for injunctive relief or specific performance on the contract? Do you need insurance to cover penalties from the loss of sequestration? In some contracts, if you have a loss of sequestration, you are liable to pay back the purchaser of the credits because they've lost the value of what they purchased. If you maintain liquid cash reserves for that, okay, but it's possible you might need some sort of insurance policy against some sort of force majeure. Let's say there was significant storm damage to your methane containment structure on your dairy. You have a major rip in your liner and you've caused a significant release of methane. Not really anybody's fault, but it happened. Will your insurance cover any penalties that you have as a result of that? Oh, but then we have to ask ourselves, how do you actually get paid for this? And note, I bury this in my presentation because I want people to think about a lot of stuff before they think about how they get paid, even though I know obviously it's the first thing on their mind. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what is the denomination of payment? Is it how much CO2 equivalent that we are storing or destroying? Okay, if that's the case, then it's a function of what practice we're doing multiplied by its storage potential to get us how many credits we're actually entitled to. Or is it simply each acre of land that we're committing to the sequestration practice, in which case our denominator is now acreage, obviously. But of course, you always have to think about, when we're talking about our aggregator, our data manager, or some other third party that's involved, what are they withholding in terms of fees, expenses, transaction costs, et cetera, et cetera. And for lots of registries too, there's a requirement for what we call a reserve pool of credits, just to take into account the fact that sequestration practices may not always be consistent and precise. In other words, if we do production practice X, we don't necessarily know that we're getting sequestration Y. There's some variability based on environmental factors there. So some registries I've looked at require a 20% reserve pool of credits to say we're going to hold 20% of credits basically in an escrow account until we can find some better way of verifying the actual amount of sequestration that's taking place on the property. Let's say that we've got that 50-year agreement and now it's over. Now what do we do? Well, look at the contract language. Are there any obligations that survive the termination of the agreement? There may be some. And again, if the goal is permanent sequestration, even though the project may only be in place for 50 years by the contractual terms, has there been any language included in that agreement that gives them an ability to enforce that beyond that period? What happens if our sequestered carbon or our greenhouse gases somehow reemerge and we empirically verify that? Or at the end of 50 years, is it just, hey, you did your service, we kept this stuff out of the atmosphere for 50 years, that's all we were bargaining for, you can go back to business as usual. There are lots of things that I think are going to evolve a lot, especially I think in the next 10 years with respect to these contracts. I think we're going to see a lot of movement. It's probably going to be pretty dynamic. I would suspect, hopefully in the next 10 years, we start to see some convergence in a lot of these terms. We see more consistency in how we verify the carbon sequestration, and things settle down to the point where there's more certainty both for the producers and also for the people that are purchasing those credits as well. I know I've spewed a lot of questions at you and talked really fast for the past 25 minutes here. It's an exciting time to really be involved in this. There's lots of opportunities, there's lots to learn, and I'm looking forward to learning it hopefully along with you. But with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation here. I'm going to switch things back over to your MCs, and I'll keep monitoring for questions. But thank you guys for your attention, and thanks for letting me be part of the program today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Again, my name is Josh Maxwell. I'm Policy Director for Glenn G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania. He's the Republican leader of the House Ag Committee, and he took up that role at the beginning of this Congress. Fortunately for me, he asked me to stick around and serve as Policy Director, and the reason for that is the background that I've had. I'm coming up on 20 years at the House Ag Committee, and during that time, most of my policy background has been in the natural resource space of conservation programs, the forestry issues, energy, and a few other. And I've dealt somewhat in this climate and carbon market space. I'm not an expert by any means of these markets. But I've had to serve a policy role looking at the consequences, both positive and negative, of a carbon market or environmental service markets as they relate in the regulatory space, whether it's the discussions that Congress had about a decade ago in cap and trade, or in the voluntary space of what we've talked about today. And so I'm going to focus my comments around that. And my remarks are going to discuss Mr. Thompson's views of climate issues, and more specifically of environmental service markets and the carbon markets for agriculture and forestry, and some of the policy discussions that are happening in that space. Before I get into that, some of these comments and one reason I don't have a PowerPoint is some of my comments, and I'll clarify those, are also my opinions. And as a congressional staffer, you want to be clear of what is the view of your boss and what I might be advising him on. And to that note as well, I do know there are some press listening, and for that I ask that you please use my comments as background. But if you need a direct quote from myself or my boss, then please reach out afterwards, and we can provide that. Beginning, these are off the record comments, but happy for you to use these comments as background. So first, let me start off by saying that Mr. Thompson, as a Republican, has really leaned into these climate issues. He believes that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the right thing to do. that global emissions are an issue that have most likely been contributing to a rise in global temperatures. But also, he cautions some of these apocalyptic scenarios that you hear about. Those aren't based on science. But again, being good stewards, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the right thing to do. And so as he looks at legislating or creating policy in the space, he has 3 principles that he has outlined. Number one, let's trust the science. And he likes to say, let's not just use political science as he moves forward in this space. Additionally, the second one is you can't have a healthy environment without a healthy economy. And when you're looking at this, especially as it relates to farmers and ranchers, these are small businesses. And if you're not providing the ability for producers to exceed as a small business, then there's no point in doing these, especially when you see oftentimes if these farms are not passed down, if they do not stay in production, the role is a lot of times they lose that impervious surface, and they are no longer natural in the space of natural solutions, and that's probably not the best path to move forward. And his third principle is let's start with what we know works. We know that natural solutions work, and we know that for farmers, the Farm Bill conservation programs work. So before Congress starts creating any new programs and looking at creating any new shiny authorities at USDA, anything, let's make sure we understand that the programs and the infrastructure in place right now is working, and what can be approved on that if needed. And what that infrastructure looks like right now at USDA is the conservation programs that are run by FSA and NRCS. And those authorities come from the Farm Bill. Many would argue that the 2018 Farm Bill was the greenest Farm Bill ever as it relates to the conservation programs, the forestry programs, and the energy programs that are available. $6 billion yearly is available in voluntary incentive-based cost share programs at USDA that help contribute to some of the practices that we have here. As a general policy solution, though, we know these work because the U.S. is a global leader in greenhouse gas reductions, both in the energy section and both in the farming and ranching section. Our farmers are the most efficient and sustainable producers of energy and food and fiber in the entire world. Matter of fact, as according to ERS, U.S. producers have increased their production from 1947 to recent years in 2019 by 287%. And I apologize, this chat that some folks are having popping up over my notes, by 287%. And they have done so with relatively no increase in input costs and relative increase. That's one of the greatest sustainability stories out there that I don't believe farmers are telling enough. And so before we start on what farmers should do, I think my boss would agree is that our domestic policies, if reducing greenhouse gases is actually a global issue, that our domestic policy should be encouraging more domestic production of energy, food, and fiber, not only for use here, but to export overseas and displace those less efficient producers abroad. Now, having said all that, let me focus a little bit more as it relates to carbon credits. Number one, my boss is very supportive of a voluntary and private environmental service markets, whether that's other environmental resources or of the carbon markets as discussed today. And before I go forward, I have to say that Shannon's presentation is one of the best I've seen as far as walking individuals through the process and the questions that are out there. And I'll be following up on how we can get that in front of our members. So I thought that was a great presentation to outline some of my comments going forward. Again, if farmers or ranchers or foresters can access these new markets and revenue streams, and if it helps in voluntary stewardship, my boss thinks that's a very good thing. However, where he gets concerns, where Mr. Thompson has concerns, is that he believes that these developing markets need to succeed or fail on their own before the government gets involved or Congress begins legislating to address issues or the inequities of these markets. Shannon made the comment of some folks saying that these markets are the wild, wild west. I kind of agree that maybe that's not the case, but also we don't actually think that's necessarily a bad thing. While these markets are somewhat novel, if they can continue to work, they'll be able to sort themselves out. You talked about the number of registries out there and whether that number will decline or increase, but also the market can hopefully answer some of these questions that have been raised, like the issues of additionality, the issues of permanence, the participants involved, and those protocols that are developed for the registries to create that market. So those are things that Congress maybe shouldn't be getting involved. We all know that the government does a great job of picking winners and losers when they do that. So I kid, maybe they shouldn't be doing that. And I apologize for the background noise. I made a calculated risk of, do I want to do this presentation in my office where we're at every day with my 4 office mates, or do I want to do it with my 2 corgis? And so we'll see which one works out best. But so again, going back to the government getting involved, when that happens, there tends to be added bureaucracy, layers of that bureaucracy added. And again, those policies can sometimes pick winners and losers. And right now, my boss wants to see an opportunity for innovation to take hold, and for, again, these markets to develop themselves without the government using their resources to stand up those inequities. And I'll get into that, what that means in a minute. So understanding these markets, again, I said Shannon had a wonderful presentation. So my boss also believes before Congress gets involved, they should really have a better understanding of what these markets are and what they're legislating on. It's a very confusing space. And in his work, he sent a letter to the chairman of the Ag Committee, Mr. Scott, and asked for a series of educational events before Congress does anything to legislate in this space. About 2 months ago, he answered some of that request, and we had a full committee hearing on carbon markets to hear from some of these folks, the registries, producers that are participating, and other players in the markets as well. But my boss hopes that there's a series of these hearings and also legislative hearings to look directly at some of the proposals that are out there. In the minority, we don't know if that's happening, but he thinks it's very important to vet this issue more, again, before Congress gets involved. Now, if we were doing some more vetting of this issue and we had USDA in front of us, there's a few things that you would hear from them. Number one, there are 3 main barriers to entry for producers. And I think that the presentation before this kind of captured some of that. Number one, there's not a high demand for these agriculture carbon credits. If you look at the space the previous 7 years, in the United States, there are around 140 million carbon credits created domestically. Less than 2% of those were in the agriculture sector. And those tended to range from $2 to $15 a credit, and we could probably equivalent those as maybe around an acre per credit. And as you saw earlier from Shannon's production costs, that's not going to meet the break-even point for a lot of these practices. Additionally, as what was pointed out, the second main barrier is the high transaction costs that producers incur. Number one, a producer has to pay for a verifier. that's going to establish a baseline for their current greenhouse gas emissions or their soil health. And then next, they're going to have to implement the practices, which could include new equipment or other inputs such as seed or whatever that might be. And then after that, they have to have other costs paid for to verify that these practices took place and that there was some type of reduction or elimination of a greenhouse gas. After that, you have to pay broker fees. You have to pay for registration costs. And then at the end of the day, USDA says most likely less than 5% of any credit would go towards profit, if any. So having said that, there are still members of Congress that believe the government should have a role in addressing some of these issues. Many of you have probably heard about the Growing Climate Solutions Act. That bill had passed the Senate very favorably and now awaits consideration in the House. I will tell you, though, that my boss, Mr. Thompson, is one of the members that is opposed to this bill in its current form, as it's currently written. And what folks talk about in this bill is to address the Wild Wild West issue of how do you connect farmers and ranchers and landowners with those verifiers, with those technical service providers participating in the market. How do producers understand the protocols that are out there, and how do you get them connected into these markets? I think the last thing that I mentioned earlier is the confusion in the marketplace, and we'll get to that. Does this bill address the confusions in the marketplace? And my boss would say that the objectives of the sponsors of the bill, that the stakeholders supporting the bill, and what the bill actually does are two different things, and that this bill needs vetting, and Congress needs to again continue to vet these carbon markets before getting involved. What I would tell you, and I'm happy to answer more questions about this bill, but if this bill were perfect, it's not, but if it were perfect and implemented tomorrow, those three main barriers of no demand for the carbon credits, the confusion in the marketplace, and the high transaction costs would still exist. So if you're still connecting producers to the market and these barriers still exist, are you actually achieving any goals? Additionally, you hear from producers about where they would like to see Congress step in. That's helping pay early adopters who may not receive as much money from a carbon credit. That's addressing the issues of small farmers and beginning farmers who may not have enough land to meet the minimums of a registry to register their carbon credits. That's to manipulate the price of the carbon through a carbon bank, where maybe someone like USDA would set a floor on these carbon credits and pay farmers and then hold that credit and sell it into the market for a loss or profit down the road. And these are just a few things, but at the end of the day, this is using human capital. This is using dollars, USDA Farm Bill resources to maybe do something more complicated that's already being achieved through the current programs. So these are conversations that Congress is going to have, and this is also going to be the debate over the next few months and next few years. I think I'll leave you with just one other issue. Again, my boss is very supportive of the private marketplace. However, again, these markets need to stand up on their own before if Congress gets involved at all. I still seem concerned when you look at some of the issues during cap and trade debate. It seems like the only way, without the government controlling the price through a carbon bank, for there to be enough value into this carbon is through regulation. Cap and trade was pushed over a decade ago, but even through EPA and USDA's analysis of these markets a decade ago, they struggled to see how row crops could ultimately succeed on this at a grand scale. How is this going to impact different regions? How is this going to impact different crops? How is this going to impact land prices? But ultimately, is there still value there? And one of the takeaways was there is, if that land's planted in trees, that as much as 60 million acres would need to come out of production and planted in trees for these markets to bring enough value to producers. I've always said that was a decade ago. I don't know if that's still true or not. A lot has changed. But then this morning, before this presentation, I was reading an article in Forbes where basically the creator of Impossible Meat was saying that these markets would be a great thing for the livestock sector, that in the United States, ranchers could take their ranch land out of grazing and plant them and stop ranching and plant them into trees. And there would be a lot of profitability there. So there is concern from my boss on government involvement and pushing forward with anything where the success stories are potentially farmers having to stop farming altogether. So with that, guys, I'm going to stop rambling, and I want to hear about what y'all want to talk about.
So thank you both. It seems like we've had a lot more discussion with your presentation than we had with my presentation earlier. So that's what I was hopeful for. So I don't know. I think some of the first questions are for Shannon, and he may have had some time while Josh was talking to sort of consider some of the issues, but I didn't know if you wanted to take the first question on the example with sequestering 1 ton of carbon.
Yeah, so if it's okay with you guys, I might take the first one, and then I think both I and Josh might want to chime in on the second one there. So let's talk about the first question. And I'll just read it from the chat here. If a farmer sequestered 1 ton of carbon in the soil on 1 hectare of land covered with the corn crop cultivation, how much money or credit can he or she claim or sell to nearby farmers who produce methane emissions from their 100 cows? So in other words, this is kind of, I think this question is a microcosm of how do offsets work. And so, I think it's a really great question because in microcosm, this is an offset. So the first question is, how does our corn farmer say, I'm going to go from conventional tillage to a no-till system, and I'm going to document that I'm sequestering X metric tons of carbon per acre as a result of that conversion? So that gets us into what Josh was talking about in terms of the registries and their standards for how they authenticate or verify that sequestration has taken place. So I'll just pick one off the top of my head. This farmer is engaged in some sort of an agreement with an aggregator, and that aggregator is using Verra as their registry. So using Verra's protocols, that's how that producer will authenticate that they've engaged in those production practices and have sequestered that carbon. And as a result of that, they generate X number of carbon credits. The aggregator pays the producer for that. Those credits are purchased by the local dairy. Let's use the 100 head dairy there for an example. They want to be seen as a producer that is, carbon neutral. So that credit is purchased by that dairy farm. Now, importantly, as we talked about, the registries serve an important auditing function here, in that we've assigned that credit to a serial number. That serial number has now been purchased by that dairy, and as a result, that's it. If that dairy sells that credit to somebody else, they don't get to take credit for, hey, I sequestered another. No, you haven't sequestered another ton of carbon. That's the same ton of carbon that the dairy already took credit for. So that's that. Okay. So I think that's really kind of in short how that happens. Going down to the next question about additionality, and this is a fascinating question. I'm so glad you guys asked this, and it's an important issue because I have a friend who serves on the Oklahoma Environmental Quality Board with me. He's been doing no-till operations on his wheat farm for 20 years, So, I mean, he's got a very well-established no-till system, has built up, phenomenal soil organic matter levels and carbon levels. Could he go out and get credit for that? And is that credit for past activity being valued the same in the marketplace as somebody who's going out and doing something new? So I think a lot of that is really a function of what Josh was talking about. How do you let the marketplace work and figure out how it values past storage versus prospective storage? And you really don't want to penalize folks that have been doing things arguably, the right way for some time, but at the same time, you're also trying to affect things at the margins. In other words, we're trying to tip, with these markets, tip production practices towards more carbon neutral or carbon negative production practices there. So that's really, I think, a function of developing better market information, which requires more transactions to get more price transparency. And that's exactly what Josh was talking about. If we've got 2% of our credits in the nation being generated from ag, there's just not enough transactional information for us to get good prices and know how the marketplace is developing that. And so, to Josh's point, and I'll shut up after this and let Josh answer too. When we talk about this marketplace being in development, really, you need more transactions taking place so you can get that market data. And part of that, and I would agree with Josh, is that maybe that's not necessarily a point of government intervention. It just takes time. We see this in wind energy development, renewable energy development. Heck, we even saw this with oil and gas development in parts of the country like Pennsylvania, Maryland, et cetera, where you haven't had a lot of activity in an industry. It takes time and it takes education for people to develop the information that they need, take care of those information asymmetries, and converge on a marketplace that works for everybody. But that takes time. And I think one of the most important things that government might be able to do is, education, help people understand what's going on, understand the transactions that are taking place. And the faster that you have more information in the hands of more people, the faster you achieve that convergence and your markets really start to work. But I'll turn it over to Josh to get his perspective on that too.
Yeah, I have a couple of different thoughts that I hope kind of get to the question. Number one on these different practices, there's still not a lot of information out there. There's, according to USDA, there's around 33 protocols, whether that be crop production or livestock and the different activities you can do that registries will accept in the ag space. The issue is that 22 of those protocols have never created a carbon credit or paid a dime in the space. So there's still a lot of unknowns on how you go forward. But then this idea of additionality is very interesting because it's very easy to say, well, we have producers that have been doing the right thing for a long time. Are they being left out or punished? But if this is a private market and voluntary, the government shouldn't begin again standing up the inequities of a private market. That'd be like saying, well, I didn't buy. I'm in the stock market, but I didn't buy Tesla. So why should the government give me some Tesla? Those are choices that are made to drive an outcome. And so, what are the final policy principles or goals, or what's the outcome we want here? Is this marketplace being established to save the world? Is this a global effort to reduce greenhouse gases? Or are we just creating a marketplace to pay farmers to adopt new practices? Or is this just a way that maybe government should get involved and it gets farmers a couple extra bucks? And so those are decisions as policymakers that need to be determined. I will say that there is concern right now that we're heading in a direction of Congress getting involved that really is going to assist and help the companies buying these greenhouse gases that are maybe greenwashing their businesses on the backs of farmers, or setting up some of the resources. When I talked about the high transaction costs that go more to these middlemen, to these verifiers and TSPs than they do the actual farmers. And that kind of goes back to my earlier comments of why don't, maybe let's take a look at what we already know. And we do know there is $6 billion at USDA that goes out every year. There are programs that help early adopters, like the Conservation Stewardship Program. And there are programs like EQIP and others that already help for the adoption of these practices, and maybe some of these issues are already sorted out. So again, it's that, where do we separate that line of a private market where folks make choices to voluntarily get in and get out, or working with what we already know?
And we have time for one more, and I told Shannon he could pick his favorite out of the chat, and we would try to answer some others later. So if he has a favorite he would like to pick to start with.
Man, that is a lot of pressure. I've been scrolling through these, and they're all really good.
They are really good.
I think I actually, and I'm not trying to volley it back to Josh, but Josh has had such fantastic insights on that. We had one question about what has been the challenge in getting these markets established for the ag credits. Why are they not selling as well as other credits? And I would say my hypothesis on that is that sequestration opportunities in agriculture are a little more diffuse. We can do some things that make a few metric tons of difference, per acre. But if I'm a power plant and I've got carbon capture and sequestration technologies, man, I can take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the exhaust stream, and there's a lot of bang for the buck there. But I think going forward, it's going to be all hands on deck. We're going to look for whatever we can get wherever we can get it. And I think that market's going to evolve over time. But I'd love to hear Josh's perspective on that too.
I think you hit it. And I have concerns personally that the marketplace for ag is just a transition place. That, as technology advances, the buyers of these credits want verifiable credits. And so if they can go to industry that can say, we can verify that we are sequestering this much greenhouse gases through our scrubbers or whatever new technology is out there, that is something for them to verify. Because right now there's only a social cost to the sequestration and to these credits. And what we are concerned is about a regulatory cost going forward, because that will have significant, if we go to regulatory path, that will have significant implications on producers and their input costs down the road. So again, does the government get involved to manipulate these prices? And that's I believe the only way you can increase these prices personally is either through the government creating regulation, or the government creating something like a carbon bank right now, because I'm just not sure down the road that the ag space, there'll just be enough demand for ag credits, even if these markets grow now. But I've kind of failed to see the path. Now, I know we're running out of time. I have to put in one plug. I think my boss would mind if I didn't. He does have a different path on this. He's introduced a bill called the Sustains Act, and what his goal is to kind of cut out the middleman of the markets. And let's take the current proven conservation programs, the gold standard of conservation delivery, and let's connect them with these Coca-Colas or giant entities or that have money that want to do good and sequester carbon, and let them donate money to USDA and pick targeted projects to kind of deal with the oversubscribed and huge demand for these programs. So I know we're out of time, but if anyone has interest in that bill, I'd be happy to talk to y'all about it later.
Yes, we are out of time. So I want to thank you both for the presentations today. They're both great. We've learned a lot in them, and there's still a lot of good questions in the chat, but I believe we've got about 2 minutes to go on break before the final panel of the day starts over. So thank you guys again.